Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Cathedral of St. John Berkman's for our adult faith formation class this morning. And this morning, as we used to do every single Sunday, we are streaming live. And whether you realize it or not, the last several weeks we've actually only been recording and then posting the recordings. But today, we now have a new camera in place. And it's great. It can zoom in and read the letters on this microphone. The technology of this is super great. One of those with a little joystick, and you can even move and zoom in on any of the images that we're looking at. And it's just a lot. It's seamless with regards to getting these great lectures and our time together and all the other different events that we host here in our parish hall streamed online. And as you may or may not recall, there are, at least when everyone knows it's streaming, there are easily the same number, if not more, people watching. And after we come back after a week and we look at the number of people who have been on, we're at 300, 400, 500, 600 people. So, but it's great to have you present here, and all of you who are watching now, welcome. So this is the seventh Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year A, which means that we are listening to the Gospel of Matthew. Today is the fourth of four installments of his Sermon on the Mount. We started with the Beatitudes, then we heard about how we're to be light and salt. Last week, Jesus was getting even more into the sermon. You have heard, but it was said, but I say to you. And we kind of had that same model in today's gospel reading. Jesus says basically, you've heard that you're supposed to love your neighbor. All right. But what I say to you is you're supposed to love your enemies also. So I also kind of think that this is a great reading to help get us ready for the season of Lent, which begins in just a few days with Ash Wednesday. So let's all make sure that we're properly preparing emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally to be able to have a great season of Lent. And as I said at Mass, why can't this be the best Lent of your entire life? You know, let's each one of it, I'm talking to myself too, let's strive to make this the best Lent of our life. And Lent doesn't exist because it in and of itself, it points us to Easter. And so we're preparing ourselves to have the best celebration of Easter, the Lord's resurrection, hopefully again, the best celebration of our entire lives. Now today, we always talk about the good, the beautiful, and the true. Today we focus a little bit more on beauty in art, Jesus Christ in art. And it is quite an interesting story all about the art from the very beginning in the Catacombs and how it is that he is depicted by the Roman people in the Catacombs, all the way through the Middle Ages. You get to Caravaggio, and you get images like we see here on the screens as well. So hopefully this nice little survey of all of Christian art is going to be very interesting, informative, but also because it relates to beauty, it's somehow going to touch your heart, your soul, and make a difference in your life, draw you closer and closer into the face of our Lord. There's so many beautiful prayers related to that. So anyhow, without any further delay, Dr. Cheryl White is going to lead us in this talk and conversation and all that is to ensue.
Thank you, Father.
Most welcome.
And he was so correct when he used the word survey. This is going to be art history in topic sentences. And also, of course, trying to survey this many hundreds of years of art history, looking at Christ, specifically at Christ. You might imagine he's probably one of the most depicted people of history in art. Is a little bit of a challenge, but this is actually a talk that I did back in early January for the Smithsonian Institution's World Art History Program. And it was, I got really, really great response to it and a lot of very good questions that came out of this. And as I mentioned to you, I thought this is why it would be great to be able to share this with you as well. So I want to begin by saying this, that when you look at portraits of most historical figures, I mean, you think about anybody in history, any person of history, when you look at portraiture or paintings, sculptures even of those historical figures, you are very often looking at an image that has been created based on some contemporary surviving physical description of that person. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean by that? That when you look at, for instance, royal portraiture, kings, queens, nobles, great generals of history, you think about anybody from across, the time that we've had artwork, particularly paintings, you're always, very often, looking at an image that was created based on someone's physical description of that person. And this is certainly true by the time portraiture really begins to evolve by the Middle Ages. That's obviously true. We take on much more, art takes on much more of an interest in the actual, capturing the actual physical attributes of that person, what surviving description we had of them. So that makes this sort of interesting, doesn't it? Because in the case of Jesus of Nazareth, if you think about it, an obscure historical figure, he's not obscure to us, of course, but obscure historical figure in the sense that there is not much written about him outside of our gospel traditions. He's mentioned in a couple of Roman histories. A Jewish historian, Josephus Flavius, writes about him, but there's not any surviving contemporary description of him. So for someone to be sort of obscure in that sense, and yet to arguably be the most depicted person in artwork ever, kind of poses an interesting challenge, doesn't it? An interesting question. He's arguably foundational to much of Western culture and Western society. So even if I were giving this to a purely secular audience, which I did when this streamed for the Smithsonian, it was a purely secular audience. I stressed that this is a figure who has impacted Western culture and Western society more than any other person in history, and yet we have no physical description of him that survives in any eyewitness account. He is the most represented figure, however. So you see kind of the disconnect there? So, as I said, there is no physical description of him in the canonical Gospels. In the Acts of the Apostles, Jesus is said to have manifested as, quote, a light from heaven that temporarily blinded the Apostle Paul, but no specific form of him is given. Isaiah foretold of him, and he's often cited in Christian literature that way. He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him. No appearance that we would be attracted to him. Does that sound familiar? We've heard those descriptions of Jesus. That's it. That's it. You got it. So we have an interesting sort of collision of notoriety of a specific person in history and his significance against a complete lack of information about what he really looked like, beyond us being able to draw some stereotypical sort of conclusions based on ethnicity. We know about the normative appearance for men in the age in which he lived, of his ethnicity and his time period. For example, Jesus of Nazareth was a first century Jewish male living in Judea. So we already know a little bit. He would have worn his hair long. He likely had a beard. His skin tone would have been olive or certainly darker than Caucasian. You know, I joke with people about this all the time. I mean, you know, my people are all English and Irish, and so I'm about as white as you can be. And he certainly would not have looked like a Northern European by any stretch of the imagination. So what is fascinating, and sort of the subject of what I want to do today, is how the depictions of him have changed across time and across culture, and to be able to speculate, maybe not know with certainty, but we can speculate about what might have caused that change? What caused that shift? How we presume Jesus of Nazareth looked is purely a product of artistic convention. Or is it? Or is it? It's a great question. Since the New Testament doesn't tell us what he looked like, so think about this for just a moment. Painters and other artists created a visual understanding. And y'all, this is important, so follow me, okay? I know, I sound like I'm talking to my college students. Okay, this is important. Listen up. Follow me. Painters began to create an understanding, a visual understanding of Jesus based on some interesting artistic patterns that began emerging by the 4th century, the early Middle Ages. Okay, and you're going to see this. I'm going to show this to you. So, but where did that pattern, where did that artistic vision come from? Where did it come from? Since we don't have any surviving physical descriptions of him, nobody wrote down what he looked like, and yet beginning in the 4th century, all of a sudden he takes on an artistic representation that becomes the standard for all art that follows. How did that happen? Where did that pattern come from? So what I want to do then is walk us through that. And literally this is why I titled the talk From the Catacombs to Caravaggio, is that from the earliest depictions, the earliest artistic depictions of him through the early modern era, Caravaggio's early 17th century, we'll stop there, after which time, of course, the imagery was pretty much set. I mean, there's not much change anyway. There are some interesting shifts that take place in the Renaissance that are culturally explainable, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit. So beginning with the catacombs, these ancient burial places for the earliest Christians, among pagans, of course, buried among pagans and Jews too, we find the earliest glimpses of Jesus in art. It's in these places. And for those of you that don't know, it can be a little bit shocking to the senses to see such a radically different depiction of him than we know today. If you go to the catacombs of Rome, and some of you I know have been, you see a much different depiction of him than you would see today. So these ancient depictions are found in these tight little spaces, right? Tight little spaces. For those of us that are claustrophobic, this can be a little bit intimidating. But this is where the earliest Christians worshipped during times of persecution. So the city of Rome, the city of the dead, a necropolis, if you will, beneath the streets of the city of Rome. The word catacomb literally means next to the quarry. So it comes from the fact that the first excavations to be used as place of burial in Rome were carried out in the outskirts of Rome in these areas that were near the site of a quarry. And this is, the catacombs today, it's a huge number of subterranean passageways, by the way, that form real labyrinths that are really, kilometers long, along which there are rows of rectangular niches that are dug out along the way. The corpses would have been wrapped in a sheet of some type, a shroud of some type, placed in these niches, which were then covered with gravestones made of marble, or more commonly, they were made of baked clay, because that was more accessible and available to people. And then subsequently, when that clay would dry, the name of the deceased was carved on the cover, and often we see accompanied by some type of Christian symbology. Roman law at the time prohibited the burial of the deceased in the interior of the city, for which reason all of these catacombs were located originally outside the walls of the city. They're separated and hidden below the ground, and think about that. It constitutes a perfect refuge in which Christians could bury their dead, yes, freely using Christian symbols during times of persecution, yes, and freely having a place to worship during times of persecution. So in Rome, there are more than 60 catacombs today. As I said, hundreds of kilometers of underground passageways that hold thousands of tombs. So we're not going to attempt to look at all of those, okay? Aren't you glad? And actually, currently only 4 or 5 of them, and I didn't check recently, one of them was closed for a while. 4 or 5 of them today are open to the public. Most of them are not. So this is, look at this. That's Jesus. The Good Shepherd, 3rd century era, so 200s. While the Gospels do not provide us with a physical description of Jesus, they do offer this figurative description to describe him. And perhaps I think the most striking that we have is the metaphor of the Good Shepherd. So in the Gospel of John, I'm going to use this as an example, chapter 10, Jesus states, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So it's not surprising then that many early Christian artists choose the image of the shepherd to depict Christ. Okay, there's another one. The Good Shepherd. Oh, we'll get to that one in a minute. Okay. They did it mostly by incorporating already existing shepherd motif that would have been typical of Greek and Roman art. This image, this one right here, is painted on the walls of the St. Callisto Catacomb in Rome, and it shows Jesus. You can see he's carrying a calf on his shoulder. Do you see that? And it looks like who? If you saw this and didn't know that I had just told you that this is Jesus and that it's because he's the Good Shepherd, and that's the imagery that they're drawing upon, these early Christians are drawing upon, who would you think that was? A young Roman man. A young Roman man. Like anybody else. Why? Why do you think early Christians might depict him as a young Roman male? We know he didn't look like one. So during times of persecution, do you understand that depicting Jesus using a metaphorical image of the Good Shepherd, representing him that way artistically in an underground catacomb, would be a place that would avoid the attention of Roman authorities? Do you see? A Roman authority looking for places of Christian worship would walk right by this and not think a thing about it, because this looks like it could be any other pagan image, except to the Christian who knew the story of the Good Shepherd. And there it is. There's another example right there. This one's also dates to the 3rd century. This is in the Catacombs of Priscilla in Rome. And again, you see the exact same thing, a young Roman male. These are depictions of Jesus in the there actually are some depictions of him as an infant as well. Most of them have not survived time that well, but in case you want to see that too, this one's from the 3rd century. This is Adoration of the Magi from the 3rd century. And obviously another image of Christ presented in the New Testament is this idea of Jesus as an infant or a toddler described in Matthew. And as a result, the Epiphany became one of the second most popular depictions that you find in the catacombs of Christian gathering places would be focused around this scene of the visitation of the Magi. This one is, as I said, found in the Catacombs of Priscilla, and the same motif is used to describe, here you find this on the front of a sarcophagus dating to the 3rd century, but this one is in the Vatican museums in Rome. So look at this. This is the healing of the paralytic. Again, a 3rd century image found in the catacombs. Remember, this is one of the miracles of Jesus chronicled in the Gospels. Matthew chapter 9, Mark chapter 2, Luke chapter 5. You see the healing of the paralytic man at Capernaum in modern day Israel. And since then, this particular episode has been a recurring feature in Christian iconography. And you find it very, very, very early in the catacombs. This depiction, again, is 3rd century. So we're talking about the 200s. 200s. And the reason I keep saying 3rd century, and the reason I keep harping on the dates of this, is because you're getting ready to see a really dramatic shift. Okay, really dramatic shift. This one was found on the baptistry of a long abandoned church in Syria, and it is one of the earliest depictions of Christ known to historians. Outside of the catacombs, this is probably the oldest one. So what's interesting is that across, and I hope you get this, that across a broad expanse of geography, this depiction of Jesus has a universality to it. He's being depicted as a young Roman man. Okay? 2nd, 3rd century, what's going on throughout the Roman Empire are persecutions of Christians. Christians are being forced into secret spaces to worship. In Rome, it's the catacombs. Okay? They literally go underground. They literally go underground. So there's obviously a link somehow to persecutions. So here's another 3rd century depiction from the catacombs in Rome. Can you identify that gospel scene? The hemorrhaging woman who reaches out to touch the hem of Jesus' garment. Right? Do you see how Jesus, again, how he is depicted? Okay, this could be any Roman man. Okay, so let's begin to take a little bit of a different journey. Okay, I think we've established the fact that you can see that throughout the early period of the empire, when Christianity was young in the first few centuries, Christians were being persecuted in large numbers. There were secret places for Christians to gather. They identified Jesus because of the gospel stories, not by how he looked. Right? Okay. So this, and I hope you can see this up here, right in the center, you can see. This is Christ between Peter and Paul. Now this is 4th century. Not even 100 years later. The image of Christ, this image of Christ dating to the 4th century, showing him between St. Peter and St. Paul, is in the catacombs of St. Marcellinus and Peter, Saints Marcellinus and Peter in Rome, located near a villa that used to belong to the Emperor Constantine. Now, what's significant about Constantine? Anybody know? First Christian Roman emperor, early 4th century, converted to Christianity, we think, in the year 312, right after the Battle of Milvian Bridge, when he won that battle over the rival that made him sole emperor. This is located near a villa that belonged to him, and below the main figures of the painting, Jesus, Peter, and Paul, you find Gorgonius, Peter, Marcellinus, Tiburtius, these are 4 separate martyrs that were of the preceding century, okay? 4 martyrs that had been buried in that catacomb, and they are depicted as they're pointing to the Lamb of God on his heavenly altar. Now, Jesus is depicted here, but couldn't you have picked him out a little bit easier? Why? Because now Jesus has long hair, right? He doesn't look like a young Roman man anymore. Interestingly, this is after the rule of the Emperor Constantine, when Christianity was made, what? Legal. And all of a sudden, same geographic area, same types of places, we're in the catacombs of Rome, and all of a sudden, Jesus begins to look like he's no longer a young Roman male, he's a Semitic man. He has long hair and he has a beard. This is after the rule of the Emperor Constantine. So this leads a lot of scholars, and guys, I'm not the only one to suggest this. This is not a new idea to me by any means. But a lot of scholars have concluded that the depictions of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, for instance, that depiction of him as of the hemorrhaging woman reaching out to touch the hem of his garment, the depiction of the healing of the paralytic, that all of that, the young Roman male with short hair, was simply a way to disguise the faith during times of persecution. It isn't that those 2nd and 3rd century Christians didn't know what he may have looked like. It's that they needed it to blend in with the rest of the catacomb art. So, the biggest shift happens in the 6th century. Look at that. This is probably one of the most famous images of Christ. Everybody familiar with this? You've seen this? The Christ Pantocrator image, the icon. This was written, they write icons, it's the technical way to say it. This icon was written in the 6th century. It's on the wall of the St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. 6th century, so 500s. The Greek word, by the way, Pantocrator, literally means he who has authority over everything. Sometimes that's why this particular icon is called the Almighty, Christ the Almighty. That's how it probably mostly is translated, as Almighty. So when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek as the Septuagint, a Pantocrator, Pantocrator, sometimes you'll hear it pronounced, was used in that Septuagint translation. Okay, so when the Hebrew is translated into the Greek, the Septuagint, this word, Pantocrator, was used for both Yahweh, okay, in the Hebrew, and for El Shaddai. So there's two words. There's one a word in Hebrew that is God, and there is a word that is God Almighty, El Shaddai. So this word, Pantocrator, is used in both of those places in the Septuagint. So that's why, and actually even Paul uses the word Pantocrator in 2 Corinthians, and I think it's used multiple times in the book of Revelation as well, directly, that word in Greek. So this image of Christ is extremely well known, maybe not as much in our Western Rite tradition, but in Orthodox, in the Eastern tradition and in Eastern Orthodoxy, it is the most famous image of him, and even in our Western Catholicism as well. Probably not as well known in Protestantism, to be honest, although it has been the subject of ongoing artistic study in so many different academic ways and for so many reasons, not the least of which, what I hope you've already seen with your eye, is the fact that it represents such a dramatic shift in the way Jesus is depicted. Can you agree with that? Did the writer of this icon seem to have any doubt what Jesus looked like? It's really interesting. It's a pretty dramatic shift. In order to represent such almighty qualities, Pantocrator qualities, Byzantine Eastern iconographers made use of certain features, artistic features, an open right hand, for instance, that could convey a sense of power and authority. This image, as I said, this is the oldest one in the world of this particular Pantocrator image. The different expressions that are shown on the right and left sides of Jesus' face, do y'all see that? Do y'all see that? Okay, so there's one way to look at this that's theological, okay? Some scholars look at this and say, oh, this is a theological statement as representing one side of his face represents his humanity, his human nature. The other side of the face represents his divinity, the divine nature. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, as some art historians have suggested, is no, something informed this Byzantine icon writer to depict his face this way. Something informed it, right? That Jesus' face was swollen. This was painted on a wooden board, by the way, as I said, during the 6th century. I told you where it is. It's Mount Sinai in Egypt, one of the oldest monasteries in the world. It is also the model not only for other Pantocrator images. It's not only the model for that, it's also the model for all future art, period. So let's really take a closer look, shall we? The sides of the face are clearly different. Does one side represent his humanity and the other his divinity? Doesn't the cheek appear to be a bit swollen, as some have argued? What about the tripartite hair, the hair that's parted right down the middle? The elongated nose? Some have suggested that this is not purely theological, but may represent an image of Christ that was known to exist. Either the image of Edessa, as it was called, a cloth that bore the face of Jesus. Some have suggested that that could be the same cloth that's held in Turin, Italy today, the Shroud of Turin face image. And there are many points of congruity. I mean, if you want to look at the swollen cheek and the hair, the way it is parted, in a future Pantocrator, I'm going to show you that there's a little piece of hair that's in the center of the forehead. I'm going to point out to you that is something that an artist would have unnecessarily added. It's a detail that didn't have to be there unless you had seen something to inform that. So a lot of art historians have posited that this depiction of Jesus was so radically different that something informed it. Somebody had seen something that led them to believe that this is what Jesus looked like. Now, this is interesting to consider, isn't it? Do we know this to be true? No. But what we do know is that this is the standard for every depiction of him that comes well into the future. It cannot help to raise the question, I don't think, about what happened between the Catacombs and the 6th century, right? What happened between the Catacombs, Jesus is the Good Shepherd, and the 6th century? Because we're not talking about an expanded long period of time. When you think about the entire history of Christian art, we're not talking about a long period of time to have seen such a major shift. What happened? What accounts for it? By the way, in Byzantine art, there is a sort of a narrative, a normative and expected way. In Byzantine, I'm talking about Eastern Roman Empire today, we would say Eastern Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy even. In Byzantine art, there is a normative and very expected way of depicting Jesus, and it always looks like this. Always. Always, like the Pantocrator on the right there. So it's safe to say that after Christianity became legal during the reign of the Emperor Constantine, who reigned 312, really beginning in 312, he issued the famous Edict of Milan the following year, which extended religious toleration to Christians. Between that time, there's not only a radical shift in appearance, but that this also becomes the standardized depiction. So I want to go back to something I said at the very beginning. Do you remember what I said at the very beginning? Of all people who you might see depicted in art, portraiture, that image is informed by something. It's usually informed by a physical description that we have of that person. Yes? Right? You wouldn't see a portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte and wonder why anybody thought he looked that way. So what then accounts for this significant shift? Most images of Jesus since that time have in common a number of traits, actually, that are now almost universally associated with him, although you do see some variants. For instance, this conventional image we have of a fully bearded Jesus with long hair, as you want to go back and look at that, okay, so that's early 4th century. That conventional image of a fully bearded, long-haired Jesus emerges around 300-ish with the legalization of Christianity, but did not become fully established until you have this, here on the right, that Pantocrator image. I would be remiss not to mention that part of the kind of the fluidity or the changing nature of this might be that the representation of Jesus was controversial in this time period to Christians who obviously believed that Jesus is God. Was it a graven image to depict Jesus artistically? Have you ever thought about this? What early Christians might have thought about that? Is it wrong to depict God in artwork? Early Christians might have had that. We know early Christians had that, by the way. The historical record is pretty clear about that. Jewish Christians, remember, would not even write the name of God. Would not even write the name of God. We have an interesting historical record I want to throw in here for you. This is a surviving letter that we have from a 4th century historian, and you've heard me mention him before. Those of you that are regulars here, you know this. You probably know his name. Eusebius of Caesarea. Y'all remember hearing about him before? Eusebius? Eusebius was the historian to the Emperor Constantine. We have a surviving letter from him, and the letter is actually written from him to Constantia. Constantia is the sister of the emperor. And she was asking Eusebius for images of Jesus and images of the apostles. Okay? This is interesting, isn't it? Christianity's legal. You have the sister of the emperor who's probably, you know, she's wanting to have her little fellowship group meet together, and they want to share images of the apostles. This is Jesus and this is the apostles. Think of much the same way we would do today when we get a holy card of a saint or whatever. You can imagine it's the same sort of sensibility in the 4th century. And in this surviving letter, he answers interestingly. He says, "Such is illegal for us, lest we appear as idol worshipers." Okay? So we have a glimpse, we have a hint that at least in the early 4th century, there was some controversy about whether you could even depict Jesus artistically. So we know that from the very beginning, perhaps, Jesus was represented indirectly. Anybody recognize any of those images? Pictogram, symbols such as the ichthus, right? The ichthus. The fish was a very early symbol. The peacock, the anchor, which represents hope. The peacock represents Christ, symbol of the resurrection, probably a holdover from pagan culture, but Christians simply adopted the symbol because they believe that, pagans believe that the flesh of a peacock does not decay or die. And all of these images that you're looking at here are from various catacombs in Rome. This is the Pantocrator that is in the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, about the 12th century. So we're talking about High Middle Ages. But you see how it's still very much the standard of what you saw in the 6th century image, pretty much the same standard. Still, that kind of expectation is very much in force. And once this long-haired, bearded Jesus became the conventional representation of him, his facial features also began to be standardized through a process that really began in the 6th century as well. By the late Middle Ages, the beard is universal, as you see here. Now, not so much so when we look at Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's a fresco in the Sistine Chapel where Michelangelo, well, let me just save that. Michelangelo was experimenting, okay, and the Renaissance permitted that. This depiction with the longish face, long straight brown hair, parted in the middle, almond-shaped eyes, you see the consistency from the 6th century to the present. Now, various sort of legends, as I said, have emerged to try to explain this consistency. And you probably don't have to guess that I'm a fan of the argument that someone had seen an image of Christ, perhaps on linen, and that informed this image. So partly to aid the recognition of the scenes, and this one actually, this is at the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul today. Obviously, this was once Constantinople, right? But again, you see the very same sort of standard artistic model, yeah? Everybody kind of getting the consistency here? It's looking the same? Universality to it. Now we're in Constantinople. The narrative depictions of the life of Christ increasingly began by the Middle Ages to be focused around major feasts of the church calendar, for instance, the events of the Passion. The suffering of Jesus was a particularly popular motif during the High Middle Ages. This, you can see it here. Actually, let me go back to this. In the Hagia Sophia, that cruciform halo that you see, that's standardized in iconography as well by the High Middle Ages, and that was worn only by Jesus and other persons of the Trinity, while plain halos began to distinguish Mary, the apostles, and other saints. So that you could look at a sort of a composite image, a composite painting, and you would immediately be able to know to pick Jesus out of a populated scene, for instance. So the influence of the new order that we have in the West, the Franciscans, for instance, by the 13th century, represents another major turning point. Some of you might remember St. Francis of Assisi is the one who began the tradition of the nativity scenes, right? That was St. Francis of Assisi. And the order in general began to emphasize more of the humility and the suffering of Jesus. In the High Middle Ages, you tend to not see him straight on, right? Like you did in that 6th century image. But the humility of Jesus, so the most common depictions you see are the birth of Jesus and the death of Jesus. And not much in between in the High Middle Ages. So the Franciscans kind of, I think most scholars would agree, they're kind of responsible for this because they approach sort of both ends of the spectrum of this emotion. There's the joys of the nativity, and that were sort of counterbalancing the agony of the crucifixion. So you have this, you see this, and this is a medieval manuscript page you're looking at here. And what you will notice in this High Middle Age period is a complete lack of linear perspective. Do y'all know what that means? When you look at an artwork and your eyes should be drawn to something, directly drawn to something, like there is a sense of perspective that you're drawn into, most high medieval art completely lacks that, and actually lacks any kind of perspective in many ways. But the medieval mind was contemplate the notion of suffering. So you see so many renderings of Jesus this way. You see this is another one here. This is 12th century as well. This is 13th century. This is a depiction, obviously, of the agony in the garden. So the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages probably emphasized the suffering. And again, what you'll notice is there's not, and this is just a representative sample. Obviously, there's hundreds, probably thousands of these images you could go find. But I chose these specifically because of the point that I made, that it's a matter of perspective. It's also that he's not looking directly at you, right? But even still, in this one, you can see the characteristic artistic standard, don't you? You don't have any doubt about who's Jesus in that picture, do you? No. The High Renaissance, and this is late medieval now. This is, we're 14th century here. So this one it looks a little more like it has some humanity to it, some elements. The human form is beginning to take on more reality by the 14th century. But the High Middle Ages, the High Renaissance featured images that focused on the depiction of Jesus with the ideal human beauty. In this work by Leonardo da Vinci, right? Most famous artwork in the world, probably. Arguably the first High Renaissance painting ever. And images of Jesus now drew on classical ideals, going way back to Greco-Roman ideals, at least in some of their poses. This rather famous painting depicts a very specific moment. This is not the first Last Supper to ever be painted, by the way, guys. It's not the only one, and it's certainly not the last one to be painted, but it's the most famous one. And you know why it's the most famous one, other than the fact that it's huge? Covers the entire wall of a refectory in Milan. because it depicts a very specific moment of the Last Supper. Who's the most calm person in the painting? Oh, okay. How do you know that's Jesus? Well, so we see the return of the linear perspective, right? Actually, the eye is drawn over his shoulder. Your eye is actually drawn over his shoulder to the landscape behind him, okay? Which was intentional on the part of Da Vinci. But what's everybody else doing? This is a specific moment when Jesus announces to all those who are gathered with him at the table that one of them is going to betray him. This is when he drops the bomb, right? He has just dropped the bomb, and now he's looking calm and serene, and the people at the table are reacting. So what Da Vinci wanted here, and this again represents another turn in art, although you see him now again depicted without question. That's who that is, because of this classical and medieval standard that has now been applied for centuries. This is late 15th century when Leonardo is painting this. You have no trouble identifying Jesus. That's not what he wanted. What he wanted here was for you to see the purely human moment that's going on, the reactions of the disciples who are grouped rather harmoniously there in groups of three. Can you see that? Groups of three. Again, returning to a classical principle of symmetry that Da Vinci reintroduces to art. From the left are Bartholomew, James the Lesser, and Andrew, in the first group of three. Then you have Judas, Peter, and John. John, who is seated at Jesus' right. Then you have, going the other direction, you have Thomas, James the Greater. Thomas, James the Greater, and Philip in the third group of three. And then the last group of three over on the right. Incidentally, Thomas, do you notice Thomas has his finger raised? That's thought to sort of prefigure his incredulity at the resurrection. Remember when he had to touch? It's thought to would be Da Vinci's way of prefiguring that. And then the last three that you see on the far right over there are Matthew, Jude, and Simon the Zealot. All of them are in various stages of reaction. So how do we know that those are the apostles I just told you? How do we know that? Because Da Vinci left a sketch, and he left notes. He left notes about what he was thinking, and that's how we know clearly his intent was to capture Jesus as a classical figure, but also embracing the artistic standard of the age so that everybody would know that was him, but then to focus the rest of the attention on that very human moment when the disciples are reacting. The disciples are reacting. So again, I need to mention this just because it's important artistically. You see the golden triangle at work. Do you see that? Do you know what we call it, the golden triangle? Everybody notice that Jesus' body kind of makes a triangle? It's an ancient classical principle, Greco-Roman art that made a resurgence, a revival, a renaissance during the 15th and 16th century. And Jesus is depicted, of course, looking a little bit away. His cheek on one side you can't really see. Now this is a footnote to this. This was done, I mentioned it's on the wall of a refectory of a convent in Milan. It was commissioned by the Duke of Milan, Sforza, but it was done with an experimental process, an experimental method that used a chalk. Well, for lack of a better term that you would know, it's like a chalk. Gypsum is what it is. And Da Vinci mixed it with a binder, something that he was actually kind of warned not to do. It's not a true fresco, but might be the most famous, as I said, obviously the most famous artistic rendering of Christ, most immediately recognized, except that most of what you see today is not Da Vinci's work. Because it was an experimental process, it's had to be restored several times through the centuries. Most recognizable. Can we agree with that? Yeah. And then we have this. This is Michelangelo. Michelangelo, who was commissioned to paint the altar wall, well, of course he painted the ceiling as well, but he was commissioned to paint the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, and he chose to depict Jesus here beardless, actually looking like the god Apollo. He does. It looks like the god Apollo. It's very clearly, I mean, can we say this is classical? Oh, yeah. How do you know that's Jesus? Well, because Jesus is surrounded by the apostles, and there's his mother right under his right arm. All of them are very recognizable. But Michelangelo made a deliberate artistic decision, took license to depart from the traditional established depiction of Jesus in art to make him look classical, like a Greek god. Christ has his arm raised in judgment. You see that, his mother Mary, the apostles and martyrs, who are all very conventionally portrayed. Jesus is the only one Michelangelo took this license with. So to depict Jesus in this rather unconventional way becomes curious, doesn't it? What have we talked about since like 9:30? How this image of Christ was standardized, how every artist used it. And now all of a sudden, you've got this almost blonde, auburn-haired, short-haired Jesus looking like a Roman or a Greek god. It's curious. Well, this was Michelangelo. This was his experimental license that he took. So it's fair to say, the reason I mentioned this particular one, obviously, well, to leave it out would be to ignore sort of the violation of the standard, wouldn't it? It's fair to say that even by the High Renaissance, when we have an established version of Jesus, it is still based on artistic conventions that some artists take. Do we see this today? That there are various interpretations of Jesus artistically? Yes. Michelangelo kind of broke the mold here. This is the standard, I said, his artistic vision notwithstanding, the standard we have talked about to this point is pretty much still the one. Pretty much still the ones. There are deviations from it. There are departures from it. The more white European or Greco-Roman depiction of Leonardo, let's go back to that even. Jesus looks a little less Semitic and more European here, right? Especially if you have a real extreme close-up of all the figures they do. But this is like, and for many this was kind of a, I don't know how to say this, a bridge too far. Because interestingly, by the 17th century, there began to be some question about whether or not Jesus had been depicted or ethnically depicted correctly. The influence of Protestant thought begins to creep in the 16th and 17th centuries, which is a reaction against a lot of the artistic license that the Renaissance took, Michelangelo especially. Protestants reacted to that. There were people in the church that reacted to this. Okay, so I don't have this to show you, but I do have time to tell you the story, and you can go look this up on your own. This painting, as I said, it's on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. In the 1990s, and I'm not exaggerating, there was a Vatican art historian who walked by it, and they just kept thinking how, people were commenting about how dark the painting was, and that it probably just needed to be clean. And she literally walked by it and kind of touched it, and when she did, she pulled off like a 1/4 of an inch of soot. And it was cleaned in the 1990s, and that's when it was realized how brilliantly blue it was, and how, and how bright these images were. So what happened is that, and you know why that is. Think about what body meets in the Sistine Chapel when there is the election of a pope. The College of Cardinals would meet in the Sistine Chapel, and they're burning ballots in the fireplace, right? And so over the centuries, this had collected some soot to it. So it was beautifully restored in the 1990s, and that's the rich colors are what you're looking at there. It was after the restoration. But when Michelangelo did this, and it's a large painting, I've focused on just the central panel because because I wanted you to see the close-up image of Christ. But all around the painting, this depicts the Last Judgment. So above him, there are souls that are ascending into heaven. Below him, there are souls that are going to hell. And Michelangelo even painted from Greek mythology, a Charon, the ferryman, the oarsman taking people to the land of the dead is in this image. There's lots of pagan imagery in it. And all of the people in the painting were nude. Okay? All of them. And there was a papal secretary who worked for, this is Pope Paul III. And papal secretary who went and complained about how lewd this painting was, that all the people were nude, and there was this pagan imagery in it, and Jesus didn't look like Jesus, and something needed to be done about this. His name was Biagio Cecchina, is his name. Biagio Cecchina, yeah. So he goes and complains to Pope Paul III, and the Pope pulled Michelangelo aside. And y'all, this is no small thing. Do you know the size of the temper that this man had, Michelangelo? He was famous for having a pretty rough temper. And when you've got the Pope kind of tiptoeing up to you, it's kind of a scary thing. And so Paul III pulled him aside and said, you probably need to clean it up a little bit, maybe cover some of the images. Just give it some thought, okay? And Michelangelo said, okay, I'll fix it. Of course, he first wanted to know who had complained. And so Michelangelo said, yeah, I'll fix it. So he did a little bit of the work that you see here. Most of this was actually done later by a student of Michelangelo's. But the most important effort he put into responding to Pope Paul III was to paint the papal secretary in the lower right corner of the painting as one of the souls who is suffering in hell. And he is suffering in hell in a very specific way. And I'm not going to describe it to you. You've got to go look it up. But it involves a large snake and genitalia. That's all I'm going to say. You can go look it up. If you thought the picture was lewd before, go look at it after Michelangelo fixed it. And the figure of Biagio Cecchina is identified. It's a portrait. Anybody who walked by it knew that's who it was. And he's wearing donkey ears, which is the universal symbol for jackass in the 16th century. So Biagio went back to the Pope. You're not going to believe what he's done now. Go look at the painting now. And Pope Paul III, in one of the greatest quotes ever of history, responded and said, I am so sorry. My jurisdiction does not extend into hell. You're just going to have to live with it. And to this day, there is the papal secretary in the bottom right corner. Go look it up. You'll be glad you did. It's totally worth it. Totally worth it. But the church has a reaction to this kind of license that's being taken. I've talked about this standard artistic depiction of Christ. Well, the church has a reaction to that, and it comes at the Council of Trent, the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent sees a reaction against these artistic liberties that were being taken, out of which is a whole new era of artists that explode on the scene, including, of course, Caravaggio. Interestingly, this Last Judgment, the clothing was put on all of the subjects after the Council of Trent in something called the Great Fig Leaf Campaign. That's literally what it was called. Including Caravaggio, though. Caravaggio is going to be the one to sort of pick up the standard after the Council of Trent. Now we're in the early 17th century, and you see the kind of the return again to the very classical, familiar, conventional understanding. But now we have Jesus set in this very characteristic use of dark and light contrast shadings. Caravaggio does this beautifully. This one's called, of course, The Taking of Christ. the kiss of Judas, the taking of Christ. Do you see the furrowed brow, the tripartite hair, the long hair, the beard? We've returned absolutely to that artistic standard. Caravaggio does this again. This is the scourging of Christ. Same thing. You see the same sort of return to the artistic standard. And by the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, you have new reports of miraculous images of Jesus that begin to appear and continue to receive significant attention. Obviously, we all know this one, Secundapia's 1898 photograph of the Shroud of Turin, which a lot of art historians believe informed that 6th century shift that you see from the young Roman man to the now very Semitic, long-haired, bearded Jesus. Controversy, of course, about that continues. You might not be surprised to know that. But this is when you begin to have the Catholic devotion approved by the Holy See. There's a devotion we have, devotion to the Holy Face. The devotion to the Holy Face of Jesus now uses the image of the face on the shroud as it appeared in the negative of the photograph taken by Secunda Pia in 1898. And that's actually the Vatican-approved medal is the one I wear around my wrist every day. It's that image. That's the Holy Face image depiction authorized by the Vatican. Then everybody knows this one, right? Very popular depiction of Jesus, namely the Divine Mercy image that was based on St. Faustina's reported vision. That has been quite the hit. Millions of people have this image, right, in their home or in their missals as a holy card. Movies have all depicted Jesus in this same way with the same general basic conventions that we've talked about, the same artistic conventions, with the exception maybe of what was the one with Tab Hunter, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, which might have been a departure in the 1960s. But I think it's fair to say that we can definitely point to a universality of understanding about the recognition of Christ in paintings, even without a halo. If I put a portrait of a man with these features right here in front of you and I didn't tell you who it was, are you going to recognize him? That's the point. That's the point. So what's interesting to historians of Christianity and of art in general is the fact that the image of Christ underwent such a dramatic shift in the period of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And that then what was said in the early Middle Ages is completely normative for us. It's what we expect. It's what we look at and say, oh, that's Jesus. Michelangelo's depiction was unusual, to say the least. That's why there was a reaction against it. Although that painting today still graces the wall of the Sistine Chapel. So what we've seen is Jesus is the Good Shepherd, Jesus the Pantocrator, the Almighty, a high medieval emphasis on Jesus' suffering and his nativity at the same time, more emphasizing his humanity. Renaissance era, you have this experimentation of a return to the classical features, making Jesus look a little more European, but with, again, apart from Michelangelo, the same standard features. And then right through today, the most depicted man in artwork is Jesus Christ. The most depicted man in the history of art is Jesus Christ, and we have absolutely no physical description of him that informed that. None. So the fact that there has been such a strong tradition of not tolerating diversity from the norm that was set in the 6th century should also tell us something, right? That there's been no toleration of varying from that standard depiction. To 2 billion people, 2.5 billion people in the world, he is God incarnate. He's God incarnate. And therefore, he has an image that is preserved in artwork that is standardized and expected, and I might add, obviously quite beautiful to contemplate, no matter, I guess, what one says he is, but he's still beautiful to contemplate. A great historical figure or God himself, this is the question I posed to the Smithsonian audience. It was obviously a more secular audience. A great historical figure or God himself. This is a truly unique aspect of art history. Truly fascinating to consider what informed the change, the beginning and the change, and now why we do not tolerate a deviation from the standard, right? Still recognizable today, yes? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. Greg, we can stop the recording. I'll stop this too. Any questions?